Hello, and thank you for tuning into our militarism series. My name is Jarvis Benson, and I am on the policy team at the Cairo Center. I have a background in international studies, and I'm currently a PhD student in sociology at UNC Chapel Hill. During this series, we will sit down with various organizers and scholars and talk with them about the violent manifestations of U.S. militarism and where we can go from here. Today, we will talk to Jessica Katzenstein. Jessica is a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at Brown University. Her research traces how police officers absorb and resist reforms during a mounting legitimacy crisis in order to understand why reforms perpetually fail to realize their promises. Drawing on 16 months of ethnographic fieldwork with officers and reformers in Maryland, she demonstrates how the everyday labor of policing makes reform efforts into a productive failure by translating them into police team terms. Jessica's work is grounded in sustained engagement with Baltimore, where she worked and volunteered for various social justice nonprofits such as the Identity Clinic. She has written about and presented on the links between U.S. police militarization and the post 9/11 Wars for the Cost of War project, and her research has been supported by the National Science Foundation grants and by the Center for Engaged Scholarship. During our talk, Jessica speaks on her research on the history of police militarization in the U.S., especially as it pertains to the transfer of military-grade equipment and resources to local police units. She makes connections between domestic policing and militarism across the globe.
That article was so good. You was snapping. Every single paragraph was just like eating the girls
I'm
up.
flattered.
So really cool. Just wanted to make sure before we get started, I have your pronouns and your name correct. So maybe introduce yourself with your name and pronouns and then we can go.
Yeah, sure. Jessica Katzenstein, and I use she, her.
Nice. Okay. Well, first question is, how did you originally get involved in your work around militarization and policing?
Yeah, so when I joined grad school, I actually had been interested in studying international development workers based in the US. That's the work that I had been doing before grad school. Realized that that wasn't what was going to keep me occupied for 6+ years. And in my first semester of grad school was when Ferguson was happening, and I did my undergrad in St. Louis, so I still have family there, and more importantly in this case, had friends who were involved in activism and were going to protests in Ferguson and so on. So I was following it closely, and I've always been interested in the sort of, I don't know what one would call it, subfield, well, methodology of studying up in anthropology. So instead of anthropology's sort of traditional colonial heritage focus on poor Black and Brown communities in the global South, I wanted to kind of take the lens and the theories of anthropology and apply it to people with power. So those two things kind of converged, and I decided to look at, for my master's thesis, decided to look at how police in Maryland sort of thought about and tried to justify the more controversial aspects of militarization. So I was particularly focused on, their department's acquisition of things like mine-resistant vehicles and semi-automatic weapons and so on, robots. So I wrote my master's thesis about that and how they kind of used preparedness discourse and the idea that one has to be prepared for anything, however unlikely. And that has kind of shifted into, now militarization is more just a part of my dissertation. But yeah, that's a long answer to how I originally got involved.
Yeah, this kind of like an invisible boogeyman that we use to justify everything. That's really interesting. So I guess to go into the next question, you write about how police militarization is as old as the U.S. policing itself. And so can you talk about some of that history of policing in the U.S. and maybe more specifically about what happened to erase our collective memory of these origins of U.S. policing? How did we get here? from this like very clear origin?
Yeah, this was such a good question. I mean, all of these were great questions, but I think this was one I struggled to figure out how to respond to, the second part about what happened to erase our collective memory. So I think I can give a partial answer with the caveat that I'm not a historian. But based on the historians that I have read and spoken to, that there's this story about U.S. policing in its sort of foundational narrative being that it's founded on this division between the police and the military, that police are not supposed to be military. They're supposed to be civilian. They're supposed to keep the peace. They're supposed to, enforce laws and hunt down criminals. And the military is what is really founded on the destruction of the enemy, and always the racialized enemy. And I think I talk in the report about how, if you look at a lot of traditional narratives about the origins of U.S. policing, they always trace it back to Robert Peel and the foundation of the London Metro Police. And what some historians have pointed out is how Peel's own ideas were founded in colonial policing in the British occupation of Ireland. And so even this founding myth itself is mythic, in the idea that there ever was any kind of separation, even in the North, which is where these histories always point to, this model. And then, of course, in the South, as many people have pointed out, especially in come a more mainstream understanding, I think, in the last few years. But as scholars have been pointing out forever, that police in the South emerged directly from slave patrols and from colonial militias, all of which were designed to control Black and working class labor and bodies. So in terms of, so that's kind of what I'm trying to argue about the histories of police militarization in the US, that in some sense, in some senses, obviously it makes sense to talk about an intensification of what already existed, but it doesn't make sense to talk about police and military as ever having been separate, either in terms of actually working together, in terms of ideology, in terms of sharing equipment, material, tactics, everything. They have always worked together and have emerged from each other. And in some countries, that's a much more clear trajectory and history. But in places like the US that are sort of founded on this division, it's really important, I think, to go back and kind of unpack that ideology. And in terms of your question about what happened to erase our collective memory, I mean, one thing that came to mind is police and police reformer PR, sort of this long history of professionalization efforts, dating back to the 1920s or so, which were designed to build up the legitimacy of police, partly, I mean, lots of things, but partly by separating them from the idea of the military, even as they were actually building on military models of discipline and bureaucracy in order to professionalize police. So I think it's really important to look at the histories of police PR to sort of understand what happened to erase our collective memory of these origins.
Yeah. Also, I think a lot about like police, like propaganda, and a lot of people talk about like Paw Patrol and like Criminal Minds and like all of these like things. That's in like our like collective, like, or I guess in the media, like very in a particular way that paints police in a very positive way. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. That is also such an important part of this, the propaganda of modern media and shows like Law and Order, Paw Patrol.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe the next question then is, what can we do to get folks to make these connections between domestic policing and militarism across the globe? maybe like in your opinion, like what's something that we can what are things that people should know, or what are ways that we should like maybe organize in this moment?
Yeah, also such a great question. I, as an academic and not an organizer, I would never, presume to tell organizers what to do, and I'll always suggest like learn, read. But what I will say is, read in my opinion, read folks like Angela Davis, radical Black tradition, especially from the 60s, where people were making all these connections between U.S. militarism and U.S. policing. I think one entry point that I know has been really mobilizing for some folks is the exchanges between U.S. policing and the Israeli military and Israeli policing. I know in New England, for instance, that got a lot of traction in the last, I don't know, decade or so, when more and more people learned about these exchange programs where U.S. police go and learn how to do counterterrorism against which Israeli police and military are using to kill Palestinians. So looking into those exchanges, I think learning about the history of counterinsurgency in general has certainly been very instructive and enlightening for me and enraging. When you trace the history of community policing, this sort of warm, soft idea, back to its roots, it's clear the ways in which it is intersecting with counterinsurgent thinking. And so, people like, and same thing with SWAT and sort of paramilitary, quote unquote, tactics. So, authors like Julian Go and Alfred McCoy have traced these connections between colonial occupation, US imperialism, imperialist wars, and policing. And I think it's also important to understand how, I think sometimes we talk about the militarization of policing as like a one-way street, when really it's, and then you get, the counter narrative is like, oh, look, but also there's the politicization of the military. Military is borrowing counterinsurgent tactics from US police in the Iraq War. But what I think those exchanges kind of teach us is that, this is actually a continuous exchange and a continuity between these death-dealing racist institutions. So I think that's reading that, understanding that continuity, I think is really important for making these connections.
Yeah, exactly. Wow. So like maybe let's like talk more about like those like transactions, and specifically like the equipment. And in your paper you wrote that the 1033 program, which we talk about a lot within the Poor People's Campaign, about like ending 1033 and like the transfer of materials from the military to local police. But you wrote that the 1033 program saw a transfer of $1.6 billion worth of equipment since 9/11, compared to 27 million before 9/11, which is, to me, was like, what? I just couldn't even conceptualize like anything above $10, not let alone like $1.6 billion, So,
right.
And then it's like anything from like office supplies, like printers and things like that, which I had like a lot of questions about like what that means. But then you also have, like you mentioned earlier, like these tanks and like these like big huge like pieces of equipment that you find in like foreign affairs. So like what is the reason for this? Another question, did you find an uptick in domestic terror to accompany this? Like were there like any groups domestically that had weaponry comparable to a mine resistant tank? Like how do we justify this type of transaction? um like how is that even covered by like this pro military PR, pro police PR that's happening?
Yeah, there's so much one could say about that. I also was really fascinated and surprised by the banality of some of the equipment and material that comes through the 1033 program, which is something that police themselves like to point out. And the agency that oversees the program also points this out regularly. What they usually miss is that in terms of value, it is the big ticket items like helicopters or vehicles that are making up most of the dollar value, but they'll point to the fact that in terms of number of items, it's mostly things like, yeah, office supplies, printers, exercise machines. So when I spoke to police about this, I know that, one of the common themes was that 1033 program is a sort of efficient way of recycling unused supplies, that it saves taxpayer money, department money, because it's all free, right? I mean, there are other issues with especially big equipment around like reporting and maintenance and things like that. But in terms of, just especially after austerity politics after the last recession, I think some of this equipment was seen as a way of filling in holes. But as I mentioned in the paper, it's also, we focus on the 1033 program partly because it's so obvious, it's so public, it's the direct exchange, right, between military and police, or the direct transfer really, but but there are also all of these other much more opaque programs which don't get as much attention, which don't have the kind of public data available that 1033 does, which itself was a product of mobilization by activists to get that data made public. Uh, so what's the reason for this? Yeah, partly a discourse of recycling as the U.S. military drew down from Iraq and Afghanistan. But one thing I found that was interesting is that now, at least, a lot of the better resourced departments, big city departments, ones that have big city budgets or that can get federal grants or take advantage of these other programs, they are not as much the ones using the program to get big ticket items, because the equipment that comes through the program, a lot of it is old, or it needs a lot of maintenance, or it's just like not the latest thing. So if they can, they will get it from companies from whom there's no, accountability or requirement to keep records. They'll get it, from these block grants from the federal government through various federal departments. So that's one interesting thing I think about our sort of focus on this program. And then you asked about an uptick in domestic terror. I think the discourse of domestic terror has always pivoted on this racialized threat perception. So, this upsurge that we see, I think, is motivated less by any kind of real rise in attacks, especially post 9/11, especially when the security state is thinking about terrorism as racialized and as Islamic terror, quote unquote. So I think it's, one sees this upsurge in coordination, supplies, everything, money, motivated much more by this instrumentalization of public fear around the rise in Islamic terror, purportedly. Now, of course, we see white supremacist and far-right domestic terror surging. I think I read an analyst arguing that this is the highest number of plots and attacks domestically that we've seen in decades. And yeah, many of these groups, especially organized militias, are well armed. I don't know anything about whether any of them have the kinds of vehicles that police do, but we certainly know they have the arms. They have the weaponry. So yeah.
Yeah, and we also know that they are police, right? Like there are
And
like
that they
active
are
members
police.
of, yeah, right. There's like a lot of layers there. So let's then talk about like the January 6th attack on the Capitol then, from which we've seen so many folks or local authorities, right, like pass these anti-protest laws in a hope to curb what they call violent protest or sedition and these other, things. Um, what's your reaction to this, I guess, just and then like how does this fall into line in your analysis of traditional US policing? What are some implications of this that we should expect?
I think what we've already seen is that, regardless of their intention or their provenance, such laws will always be enforced unevenly against progressive, radical, leftist movements, especially led by people of color, not against the right. They'll be used to protect property and to demoralize and harm left-leaning protests and protests for liberation. So I think that, and obviously we've seen a lot of these anti-protest laws are brought explicitly by right-wing legislators against, in response to BLM or other protests, Black-led protests. But even, legislation purporting to be about right-wing violence. I think, partly, of course, because it's police who are going to be enforcing these laws at the ground level before obviously one gets into prosecutors and so on. And partly just because of how the system of laws works in the US. I think we'll always see those kinds of laws used to criminalize and harm people who are already criminalized and harmed, and not, except in anecdotal cases, be used for protecting people against right-wing and racist violence.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and I think maybe then that leads to another question of just diversity within policing, right? Which I think a usual reaction or a common reaction, right, to the problem or the issue of policing that we have within the country. Common reforms are increased diversity within the police system, like bias trainings and things like that can get or that are proposed to get to the root of the problem of policing in this country. So what do you say to like those calls? And are these things that would be effective, I guess?
Yeah, great question. So I think one thing that it's important to note before I give my response is that, there's obviously, so on the one hand, one has the symbolism of non-white or female and so on, non-traditional police. The symbolism has a very deep emotional dimension, I think, at least for some folks. And there's also the political promise, particularly dating back to the desegregation of police forces in the US, the political promise of non-white officers that, I've in my fieldwork, I spoke to a few retired Black officers who, started working right after departments were desegregated, and I think their approach to this issue is much different than what I think one sees today, and I think that's an important, inheritance and history to keep alive. At the same time, as statistics on police violence, particularly against people of color, have shown, and as Black feminist thinkers have been arguing forever, diversity in policing ultimately solves nothing. So there's an anthropologist, Aisha Beliso de Jesus, who talks about how officers of color are kind of recruited into this post-racial blue identity as a way of talking about how the institution and its logics are infinitely more powerful than any individual notion or understanding of identity. So I think it's, with this question, it's important for people to understand, the power of institutional logics and the control that the institution has over its officers, and I don't just mean directly, but ideologically also. And more officers of color, more women officers in policing. There's the argument that it might make certain individual encounters better. So, for instance, having women police be the ones to respond to sexual assault cases. Though, of course, one can't presume solidarity in any individual case. But, those individual encounters aside, the face of the institution remains white supremacist and designed for the protection of property. And it recruits all faces into its projects. And I think there's, diversity in policing is never going to be an escape from that. So that's my very pessimistic answer.
Yeah. It's hard to be like very positive and like, this is work. Like this will do it, like this.
No, it's
so then
sweet.
I guess, so I guess then, like, thinking about like the reforms that don't work or haven't worked, right? Like, what could it look like then to try something else? Or like, what is your response to like the defund calls that have come up, and calls to dismantle police departments or calls to abolish the police in general? What could that look like to you?
So I didn't start this project being particularly well informed about abolitionist thinking, and I think my research has turned me into an abolitionist. So my dissertation is actually about how police absorb and translates reforms, and so how anything that gives police more power, discretion, or even just legitimacy will just reproduce the violence of the institution. So, more money for scenario trainings on bystander intervention is one thing that's been proposed after the murder of George Floyd. And, I think one could point to any number of examples to show how police thinking and training and so on around safety, camaraderie, et cetera, sort of infuses these reformist efforts and prevents any substantive change from happening. There are so many foundational problems that folks talk about, and that I saw in my own research, from qualified immunity to the legal primacy of officer safety concerns to just what the foundational mandate of policing is, which is not something that any reforms are going to be able to change. Too many foundational problems to be able to address by just throwing money at it. So, Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about, makes this distinction between non-reformist and reformist reforms, and argues that anything that gives more money to police is a reformist reform and should be avoided, and non-reformist reforms obviously being harm reduction that should be supported. So I support that. I support abolitionists like Miriam Cabo, who argue for removing money from police solutions and redirecting it to policed communities. And of course, recognizing that at the same time, any effort to defund or dismantle or abolish police has to go hand in hand with dismantling white supremacy, capitalism, ableism, etc.
Period. Like that's the only like that's the only way. And yes, I also like, I don't know if you've engaged with Mariam Kaba's new book, We Do This Till We Free Us.
I haven't gotten to read it yet, no. What did you think of it?
So good. So good. But yeah, there's a really great piece in there that talks about just really, like, she outlines like if you should support this reform or not. And it talks about like, does it give more money to the police? then no. Like, and so yeah, I completely agree. And also thank you for naming like all of those really great folks within the Black radical tradition. So then the next question, like kind of pivots and is related to that, but thinking about like how Reverend Dr. King called militarism one of the triple evils alongside poverty and racism, and how we today in the Poor People's Campaign are trying to link militarism with poverty, racism, ecological devastation, all these terrible things. We know that to end poverty and racism and ecological devastation, we must end militarism, like you named. What would it take to build the political will to do this today, and what keeps us from doing this?
This was also such a great question that I don't fully know how to answer. And, what I do have is, yeah, again, very indebted to thinkers from the Black radical tradition. One thing that came to mind, particularly given the current context of the pandemic, is that I think gets talked about less within the U.S. Than some other issues is U.S. centrism, and not just not thinking of other countries, particularly global South countries, and other lives. I think militarism persists obviously for many reasons, including massive investments and profits. But I think another aspect is, that Iraqi, Syrian, and so on lives are just seen as more disposable, and it's not lives that many of us think about. And that's why I so value and draw on the work of someone like Angela Davis, who has always been naming these connections between, Black freedom struggle in the US and Palestinian freedom struggles, and so on. So, that's obviously a question of racism. It's also a question of imperialism and global white supremacy. And, I've been thinking about what's, this is getting slightly off track, but hopefully I think it's relevant that, one is seeing this massive proliferation of articles in mainstream American media and, Atlantic, Washington Post, whatever, about how we're returning to normal. There's, I think, one that just came out about how American progressives are too obsessed with or too focused on the pandemic to the detriment of science, and how we need to reopen schools and so on. And so, it's violent in so many ways. One, of course, being that clearly that author and the people who think like that are not coming from communities that have been devastated within the US, that have been devastated by the pandemic, and are clearly coming from class positions where it's possible to safely return to work or return to school. And this, very American centric idea that because the pandemic is ending for some of us, therefore it's not relevant anywhere else, I think is sort of symptomatic of that problem. So I think, again, this is a very partial answer, but I think considering non-American and especially Black and Brown people in the global South lives as equal to our own, as equally meaningful to our own, and recognizing that our own violent imperialist state is destroying other people's lives in our names, I think is one component of working to end militarism.
Yeah, thank you so much for naming that. And it's just, I think anti-Blackness is like so pervasive in like every like facet of like current life. And so yeah, it's just very heavy. And I think like, yeah, the things that you named are like really important for folks to know. And so the next question then is related, thinking about like what are the key issues then we are those that we need to be asking of the new administration, in order to combat some of these issues?
Yeah, also a big question. You know, one of the things that immediately came to mind was something I don't think the administration or Congress will do, but nonetheless, passing the BREATHE Act rather than the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which the Movement for Black Lives and many others have denounced for reproducing the same reformist solutions that we have seen reproduced for decades, which have not worked and which will not work. I think also at a broader level, investing in progressive legislation, things like the Green New Deal, Medicare for all, higher taxes on the wealthy, basically social economic policies that actually work toward addressing the problems created by capitalism and racial capitalism. I think we need to just very broadly ask the new administration to not invest in policing. I think we've seen, on the one hand, we've seen this administration offer some more progressive solutions or more progressive policies than I think many people, including me, anticipated on some issues. Of course, on other things like immigration, the administration has carried forward a not surprising but still enraging number of policies from the previous administration. But at the same time, I think we've also seen the administration, especially after the insurrection at the Capitol, pushing more investments in policing, and I think that's something that we need to protest and combat, and certainly not support.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree. It is a weird world that we are living in. But yeah, I would ask this last question. But I feel like that would lead us into several more rabbit holes. But maybe let's just go for it.
Up to you.
What
Yeah.
are the forces then that are stopping these changes, and that are promoting militarism and policing? Like, what are some forces that we should name, that we should know, we're up against in this work?
Yeah. Yeah. So this, I mean, just as a very partial list, a few things I've thought of off the top of my head. I think one just being this idea that the police and military are separate and separable in any meaningful foundational way. I think harm reduction is extremely important, but I think behind that harm reduction also has to be the recognition that demilitarization of policing is at a foundational, substantive level not possible. Police and military are not fully separable institutions. I think also, of course, massive investments in the military, which is what Cost of War Project is other aspects of it are central aspects of it are focusing on. These just huge, again, death dealing machines that we've built up that make gigantic profits for corporations and that employ so many people, is certainly an incredibly powerful set of political forces. I think just to reiterate US centrism and white supremacy, the idea that the lives of the people who are at the butt end of US militarization and policing are less worthwhile, less meaningful, is of course a very potent political force. And I think also just our ideological investments in these institutions. It's, that's, I think, no one could say that that's the primary force, but I do think it's an important one. The willingness to grant legitimacy, which of course is especially a powerful force among the people with the most power, who are the least targeted by these institutions. So this is not, obviously, legitimacy granting is not even or equal, but the granting of legitimacy to policing and the idea that it can be reformed, that it can be peaceful, that it can be non-racist or less racist, or less ableist, or less misogynistic. I think all those things help reproduce policing. And same with the military, or sort of collective cultural veneration of the institution, which is also obviously tied into how the military sells itself and the pathways that it offers through forgiving student loans and career opportunities and so on, particularly to people from poor communities. All of that is obviously very powerful. So I think those are just a few of the forces that one could talk about. But yeah.
A few of the many. Yeah. A few of the many. Well, Jessica, that's all the questions that I had. But I really, really appreciate your mind and what you offered to this space. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add or to bring up before closing?
I actually wanted to ask you, if you have time, what your thoughts are, what you're thinking for this project, what you've gotten from other folks you've talked to.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been really interesting. So so like I'm on the policy team at Kairos, and I also have done a lot of organizing like within DC, and back at home in Mississippi, with like some abolitionists and like anti-militarism types of groups. And it's just been really interesting to see folks, how folks get it, like, and I guess I'm engaging with, folks that are like thinkers in this realm, quote unquote. But like, I think I've seen that, like, when you talk to like people, and like people like really sit down and like think about like the terrible things that are happening in the world, and specific to like policing and militarization, like people understand the connections. I think like people are like, especially now, right, like after the uprising of last summer, like people do understand the connections. I think it's just very difficult to get people to imagine, and it's very difficult for myself to imagine, right? And so I think like that's something that I am trying to build out of these conversations is, there's another world that's possible. And like, how are we like moving towards that? Like, and who are the folks that are, or like, what is a map that we can build together to get us there? And I think that that's something that I'm trying to build out of these, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. It's genuinely people like you who give me any kind, especially being just like immersed in the criticism of these institutions and not immersed in spaces where people are working to, non-reformist spaces where people are working to imagine something better. That's all that the only space I think where there's any open promise.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's a lot of hope. like some of the more hopeful spaces that I've, and I think it's both like very saddening and also very hopeful at the same time. To imagine that there's something more that we know that we can work towards. I think that's what is really beautiful about this type of work.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, if nothing else, I'm gonna let you go. So good talking to you. If you ever have anything else, please let me know. always
Yeah,
here.
definitely.
Yeah.
No, it was great to talk to you. I'd also, yeah, I look forward to seeing what you produce and hearing what you think of everything that comes out of these conversations.
I will talk to you later. Thank you so much.
Yeah, definitely.